Usually when we look for a diagnosis, whether it's for some kind of physical ailment or, I don't know, a societal problem, there's this underlying expectation of mechanical precision.
Right, like a one-to-one correlation.
Exactly. Like if you break your arm, you go to the hospital, the x-ray reveals that jagged white line on the radius, and the doctor just points at it. There it is, broken.
It's a very binary system of evaluation.
Yeah.
And, it gives us this immediate sense of control.
Yeah, it's clean, it's categorized, and honestly, it's comforting. But the moment you pivot away from a fractured bone and step into the realm of human cognition, into the way we perceive reality or the way we suffer and entangle ourselves in our own thoughts, that X-ray machine just completely shatters.
Oh, absolutely. We suddenly find ourselves staring at a diagnostic landscape that is just incredibly murky.
It really is.
It requires a completely different kind of diagnostic lens.
Yeah.
Because the disease, if we even want to call it that, isn't some foreign pathogen.
Yeah.
The disease is often the very instrument we're using to examine the problem.
Which brings us directly to the core of our discussion today. This deep dive is explicitly titled Comparing General Semantic and Madhyamaka. And before we even take the first step, I want to acknowledge you, our listener.
Yes.
Because we know that you are already deeply immersed in Madhyamaka philosophy. You're familiar with the intricacies of Nagarjuna's thought, the rigorous dialectics of second-century Buddhism, the deconstruction of inherent existence, all of that.
You live and breathe this stuff.
Right. So I want to be really clear about our mission today. We are not here to re-explain the basics of emptiness or the nuances of conventional truth to someone who already gets it.
No, that would be totally redundant. Instead, we are setting up a highly specific structural comparison.
Yeah.
We're taking that ancient, rigorous philosophical framework that you're already intimately familiar with, and we're putting it in direct dialogue with Alfred Korzybski's 20th century Western system, which is known as general semantics.
And what makes this so compelling to me is that we're looking at a modern, scientifically grounded system of linguistics and neurobiology that somehow, almost accidentally, arrived at a startlingly similar diagnosis of the human condition as Nāgārjuna did centuries earlier.
It really is a striking parallel.
We're going to explore those profound structural convergences. I mean, both systems function as radical deconstructive therapies for human cognition. But, and this is crucial, we're also going to locate the exact metaphysical impasse where these two systems just fundamentally break apart.
Because while both frameworks operate on the premise that human suffering or dysfunction is a cognitive disorder rooted in our linguistic habits, their ultimate prescriptions sit on entirely different bedrock.
Right.
One system is trying to build a better, more accurate map of a real physical universe, and the other is actively dismantling the very concept of bedrock entirely.
So let's pull on that thread right away, the shared diagnosis. This centers around the concept of reification. Now, our listener knows the Madhyamaka concept of sadati satya, right? Conventional truth.
Yeah, the idea that everyday language forces us to project artificial boundaries onto a reality that is fundamentally fluid.
Exactly, it's ungraspable. Now, in the 1930s, Alfred Korzybski coined an axiom that echoes this almost perfectly. He stated, "The map is not the territory."
And to really understand general semantics, we have to look at how literally Korzybski meant that phrase. He wasn't just speaking in metaphors.
He meant it as a physical reality.
Yes. General semantics approaches cartographic reification, basically the disease of reification, as a tangible biological and neurological glitch. We're physically confusing our abstract conceptual models, the neurological maps our brains generate, with the ultimate submicroscopic physical reality, which is the territory.
Let's ground this in an everyday scenario just to make it concrete. The classic analogy is walking into a restaurant, looking at a menu, and trying to literally eat it.
Right.
Obviously, if I look at the word steak printed on this thick cardstock and I start chewing on the paper, I'm going to be very confused as to why it doesn't taste like meat and why I'm getting zero nutritional value.
The menu analogy works for the surface level of the problem, sure. But let's take it a step further because it actually fails to capture the deeper neurological damage Korzybski was diagnosing.
How so?
Well, when you eat the literal paper menu, the error is immediately obvious to you. You know you're eating paper. But in daily life, general semantics argues, we're eating the menu constantly and we don't realize it.
Oh, wow.
We react to the label, the word, the concept, as if it possesses all the physical properties of the actual event. And Korzybski traced this directly back to the very structure of the language we inherited, specifically the subject-verb-object grammatical triad of Aristotelian logic.
Okay, let's unpack that. How exactly does subject-verb-object grammar cause us to eat the menu? Like, mechanically, what's happening?
Well, think about a simple sentence. The boy hit the ball. Aristotle looked at the macroscopic world with the naked eye and saw discrete things doing things to other things.
Right. Nouns doing verbs to other nouns.
Exactly. So we developed a grammar that reflects that macroscopic illusion, a subject, an action, an object. General semantics argues that this structure forces what Korzybski called elementalism onto our nervous systems.
Elementalism.
Yeah. We split things apart with words that absolutely cannot be split apart in physical reality.
Because in reality, at the level of physics, the boy hitting the ball isn't three separate entities.
Precisely. At the submicroscopic level, the level of quantum mechanics, kinetic energy, electron fields, there is no isolated boy, no isolated hitting, and no isolated ball.
It's all just one continuous process.
It's a unified process of interacting electron clouds, energy transfer, and localized space-time events.
Ew.
But because our grammar forces us to articulate this event as three distinct, separated pieces, our brain begins to hallucinate that the universe is actually constructed out of isolated Lego bricks.
This maps so cleanly onto the Madhyamaka critique of dualistic conceptualization. I mean, Nagarjuna's entire project is tearing apart this illusion of independent entities acting upon one another. Both systems seem to be pointing out that everyday language acts like a cookie cutter. We take this cookie cutter of grammar, press it into the fluid dough of reality, pull out these little distinct shapes, and then we have the absolute audacity to believe those shapes existed inherently in the dough before we cut them.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And general semantics takes that philosophical observation and grounds it firmly in neuroplasticity. When we repeatedly use elementalistic language, we're literally training our cortices to misfire.
We're rewiring our own brains badly.
We're training our nervous system to respond to our own linguistic projections rather than the actual submicroscopic physical reality unfolding in front of us.
I want to pause here, though, because this raises a really nuanced distinction for a Madhyamaka practitioner. In Madhyamaka, the menu, the map, conventional truth, is a dependently arisen illusion. It is completely empty of inherent existence. But does general semantics view the map in that same ontological way, or does GS view the map merely as, like, a low-resolution biological necessity? Like, is the map just a glitch caused by the fact that our sensory organs kind of suck?
This is where we start to see the structural differences emerge. For general semantics, the map is a strict biological abstraction. The physical territory, which Korzybski defined as the swirling atoms, the light waves, the kinetic energy of the quantum field, is bombarding our nervous system constantly.
Millions of data points a second.
Exactly. But our sensory organs are highly limited. The human eye cannot perceive ultraviolet light. Our ears cannot hear the frequencies a dog hears. So our nervous system filters this infinite complexity, abstracts it, and generates a low-resolution map just so we can navigate without being totally overwhelmed.
So for GS, the error isn't that we have a map at all. We clearly need edge detection software so we don't, walk off a cliff or get eaten by a bear.
The map is absolutely vital for survival. The cognitive disease occurs when we forget that the map is missing 99% of the data. We commit cartographic reification when we assume our low-resolution localized abstraction is the absolute totality of the event.
Right. If both systems agree that mistaking the map for the territory causes profound human dysfunction, how do they specifically target the mechanics of that false map? We know Nagarjuna goes after svabhava, right? Inherent existence. He relentlessly deconstructs the idea that anything has an independent self-nature. How does a 20th century linguistic system target that exact same delusion?
They target it through a very specific piece of grammar. The most intense technical overlap between the two systems occurs in their shared assault on the concept of essence. But while Madhyamaka attacks svabhava philosophically, general semantics attacks it linguistically through the English verb to be.
A verb to be.
Specifically, what Korzybski identified as the is of identity and the is of predication.
It's literally the most common verb in the English language. How does general semantics turn that into the primary villain of human cognition? Let's start with the is of identity.
Well, consider it very standard sentence. John is a criminal.
Okay. We hear statements like that every single day. It sounds entirely functional.
It is functionally disastrous from a general semantics perspective. By using the word is, you are mathematically equating a single labeled criminal with the absolute totality of the organism named John.
You're locking him into a box.
You are establishing a false identity. You are implying a static, unchanging essence. That little two-letter word completely ignores John's childhood, his biological state, his genetics, his future potential, and the specific context of whatever action he took.
Wow, yeah.
You've taken a fluid, complex process and linguistically frozen it into a permanent noun.
For you listening, this is the exact mechanism of assigning svabhava. We are declaring that John's fundamental, independent self-nature is criminality. We are acting as if criminal is some kind of mystical substance residing inside his atoms. And what about the is of predication? How does that operate differently?
The is of predication occurs when we take our internal subjective sensory reactions and project them outward onto an external object, claiming they are inherent properties of that object.
Give me an example.
The classic one is, the rose is red.
We look at a flower and state it as an objective fact about the universe.
But the rose possesses no inherent redness. Redness is not a physical property residing inside the cellular structure of the petals.
Right, there are no red atoms.
The rose merely absorbs certain electromagnetic light waves and reflects others. Those specific reflected waves travel through space, hit the retina of your eye, travel down your optic nerve, and your specific human occipital lobe translates that frequency into the subjective experience we call red.
So if a colorblind person looks at the rose, or like a bee with ultraviolet vision looks at the rose, the redness doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist out there in the territory. When you say the rose is red, you're taking a highly localized, deeply personal neurological reaction, projecting it out into the physical universe, and claiming it belongs to the object. General semantics argues that identity is a mathematical impossibility. They rely on two principles: non-identity and non-allness.
Let's break those down. Non-identity means?
It means that no two things in the physical universe are ever exactly identical. Not even two factory-made microchips that look identical to the naked eye. Because if you put them under an electron microscope, their atomic structures differ.
Right.
Furthermore, a single object isn't even identical to itself across time. The microchip today is missing atoms it had yesterday due to friction and decay.
And non-allness?
Non-allness means you can never say all about anything. Your map always leaves out details. So whenever we use the verb to be to claim A is B, we are fundamentally violating the laws of physics. We are ignoring context, we are ignoring submicroscopic differences, and we are ignoring the passage of time.
But the stakes here aren't just academic, right? General semantics posits that this grammatical habit causes severe psychological and societal fallout. They talk about signal reactions, correct?
Yes, and this is where the system shifts from philosophy into a therapy. A signal reaction is an unthinking, knee-jerk neurological response to a label, rather than an objective evaluation of the unfolding territory.
Like getting triggered by a word.
Exactly. If you deeply believe John is a criminal, your nervous system reacts to the terrifying label. You might experience an increased heart rate, anxiety, or aggression. You immediately close off all objective evaluation of the actual human being in the present moment.
That mirrors the afflictive clinging and aversion we talk about in Madhyamaka perfectly. We suffer because we're reacting to a phantom essence that our own language constructed. We get angry at the label, we get terrified of the label, and we completely miss the dependently arisen reality of the moment.
And this ties directly into the general semantics concept of multi-ordinality.
I want to spend some time on this, actually, because multi-ordinality is one of those GS terms that can sound incredibly dense. How would we explain this in a high-stakes, real-world scenario?
Think about an argument between two spouses in marriage counseling. One spouse says, "You are being aggressive." The word aggressive is multi-ordinal. It means that the trait doesn't exist inherently in the action. Its meaning changes entirely depending on the level of abstraction from which you are observing it.
Walk me through those levels of abstraction. How do we get to aggressive?
At the lowest level, the submicroscopic event level, there's just an intersection of biological processes. Vocal cords vibrating, lungs expelling air, cortisol levels rising. That's the territory.
Pure physics.
Pure physics. Move up a level to the descriptive map. He spoke at 85 decibels and stood up from his chair. Move up another level to the inferential map. He is angry. Move up one more level to the judgmental map. He is aggressive.
So the aggressiveness isn't in the vocal cords. It arises purely from the relationship between the observer's specific filtering process and the event.
Exactly. It is a temporary structural profile arising from a relationship. For you listening, this directly parallels Madhyamaka's rigorous logical proofs, demonstrating that the characteristic and the characterized mutually co-define each other.
Yes.
You cannot find the aggressiveness if you dissect the person, just like you can't find the fire if you dissect the individual atomic components, the wood and the oxygen.
Okay, I track completely with the diagnosis, but I have to play devil's advocate regarding the cure. To fix this is of identity, General Semantics prescribes some very specific, almost mechanical linguistic tools. The most famous is E-prime, or English prime.
Right, a fascinating tool.
This is a practice where a person attempts to speak and write while completely banning all forms of the verb to be from their vocabulary. No is, am, are, was, were, be, been, or being.
It is an incredibly difficult cognitive exercise.
I can imagine, instead of saying, this deep dive is interesting, I would have to say, I find this deep dive interesting, or this deep dive holds my attention. I am physically forced to put the observer myself back into the equation.
It forces structural accountability. You can no longer hide behind objective-sounding declarations.
I respect the accountability, I really do. But I have to push back for our Madhyamaka listener. Nagarjuna demands a total ontological shift. He demands the experiential realization of emptiness, the profound unbinding of the mind from the cycle of samsara. Isn't E-prime just a superficial semantic trick? I mean, is forcing people to play a grammatical game where they ban a verb really going to cause a profound spiritual or cognitive awakening?
That critique gets right to the heart of how cognitive conditioning works. Korzybski's argument, which was heavily influenced by the neuroscience of his time and actually holds up remarkably well under modern neuroplasticity, is that language is not just a passive output of thought.
It doesn't just reflect what we think.
Language structures thought. The neural pathways of the human brain are physically shaped by the syntax we use repetitively.
So the grammar isn't just the exhaust pipe of the engine, it's the steering wheel.
Exactly. E-prime is not a game. It is a neurological wedge. When you attempt to speak in E-prime, you realize how heavily you rely on the verb to be as a crutch to avoid critical thinking. By forcing yourself to pause and construct a sentence without it, you are mechanically interrupting the brain's habit of reification hundreds of times a day.
You're manually overriding the glitch.
You are constantly forcing the brain to recognize the gap between the map and the territory. For general semantics, you cannot achieve an ontological shift just by thinking about it philosophically. You have to physically change the behavior of the nervous system. And syntax is the primary tool to do that.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like cognitive behavioral therapy operating at the granular level of grammar. If you stop building the phantom essence with your words, your brain eventually stops searching for it in reality.
Precisely.
But this leads to an obvious problem. If we strip away the is of identity, both systems are essentially left with entities that don't exist independently. They lack svabhava, they lack permanent identity. But we still have to function in reality, right? The acorn still manages to grow into the oak tree, the car still crashes. How do these two systems explain the way things do interact in the total absence of independent essence?
This requires us to look at the architecture of reality as posited by both systems. In Madhyamaka, our listener knows this architecture as prakrityasamutpada, dependent origination. The realization that all phenomena arise, abide, and cease, purely independent upon a vast web of causes and conditions.
Right.
General semantics arrives at a functionally identical model, which they term multi-causality, or structural variance.
Multi-causality, which means a total rejection of the classic linear event A caused event B model that we use in everyday life.
General semantics views linear cause and effect as a primitive oversimplification. It's a hangover from that subject-verb-object grammar. In the territory, event A never simply causes event B in a vacuum. Let's look at a car crash on a rainy night. Our linear map says the rain caused the crash.
But the rain alone didn't cause it.
The crash is the relational intersection of a near-infinite causal web. It is the rain, combined with the specific worn tread depth on those exact tires, interacting with the specific friction coefficient of that particular patch of asphalt.
There are thousands of variables.
It is the driver's fatigue level, the glare of the poorly designed streetlights on the retina, the timing of the traffic signal. You can even trace the web back to the municipal budget cuts that delayed the road maintenance.
The web stretches outward infinitely in space and backward infinitely in time. And this brings in a massive influence on general semantics that we haven't touched on yet. Albert Einstein. General semantics doesn't just borrow from linguistics. It heavily incorporates the physics of relativity. They completely reject the idea of absolute space and absolute time.
Korzybski recognized that our Aristotelian language treats space like an empty static box and time, like an invisible river flowing through that box at a constant speed. This is elementalism, manifesting at the cosmic level, splitting space and time into two independent inherent nouns.
Right, taking the cookie cutter to the universe itself.
General semantics demands non-elementalism. You have to mentally hyphenate it. Space-time. Time and space are not a static theater stage where events happen. They are localized processes entirely tied to the observer's frame of reference.
So, just as Nagarjuna dedicates entire chapters to refuting the inherent existence of past, present, and future, General Semantics says that your now is structurally different from my now. There is no absolute cosmic clock ticking away in the background.
And because there is no absolute stage and no independent entities, the observer and the observed are locked in a continuous transactional relationship. General Semantics calls this the co-evolution of the perceiver and perceived, which operates through neurolinguistic feedback loops.
This cybernetic feedback loop is fascinating. Walk me through the mechanics of how the perceiver co-evolves with the perceived in a GS framework.
It operates as an engine of continuous structural alteration. The physical territory sends stimuli to your nervous system. You abstract that data, filter it through your current linguistic limitations, and generate a mental map. Based on that flawed map, you take physical action in the world. You alter the territory. You invent a tool, you build a city, or you create a social media algorithm.
Okay, so I've changed the environment based on my map.
Now, that newly altered physical territory sends new stimuli back to your nervous system. But this new stimuli physically rewires your brain. It alters your neurochemistry, your attention span, your spatial awareness. This creates a new type of perceiver who then generates a new map, which alters the territory again.
It's a real-time cyclical engine, and General Semantics uses a very specific term for this process as it applies to human history: time binding.
Time binding is Korzybski's definition of humanity. He argued that plants are chemistry binders or energy binders. They convert sunlight. Animals are space binders. They move around their environment to survive. Humans are time binders. Because we have symbolic language, we can pass our maps across generations. We inherit the knowledge of the dead.
But we also inherit their flawed maps. We inherit their semantic diseases.
Yes. Time binding creates a real-time historical loop where evolving environments physically rewire evolving minds. Generation A invents smartphones based on their conceptual maps. Generation B is physically born into a smartphone-saturated environment.
And that changes them entirely.
That environment literally alters the development of their cortices. The perceiver creates the environment, and the environment simultaneously creates a new type of perceiver.
This mirrors Madhyamaka's assertion that subject and object co-arise instantaneously. They lack any independent existence prior to their interaction. The eye and the visual object co-create the visual consciousness. But here is where I want to test the strength of the GS system against Madhyamaka, because it seems to me that General Semantics might be relying on a crutch.
What kind of crutch?
Well, this feedback loop of perceiver and perceived sounds to me like a real-time multiplayer video game. The player's physical inputs on the controller render the digital world on the screen, but the rendered world on the screen simultaneously alters the player's brain chemistry, making their palms sweat or their heart race. The game and the player co-create the experience. But here's my critique. Doesn't General Semantics rely entirely on physical biology, like retinas, cortices, sound waves, and physical environments to prove this loop? Madhyamaka proves the mutual codependence of perceiver and perceived purely through logical deduction without ever needing to reference a physical brain. Is GS too reliant on materialism here?
If we look closely at Korzybski's background, your critique points directly toward the fundamental schism between the two philosophies. Korzybski was trained as an engineer. He trusted the physical sciences implicitly. General Semantics uses the physical biology of the brain, the limitations of sensory organs, and the mechanics of the quantum field to prove the relativity of perception. It is a scientifically bounded system.
Right. Nagarjuna doesn't need an fMRI machine or a particle accelerator to prove that subject and object are mutually dependent. He proves it logically.
But before we fall into that metaphysical chasm of materialism versus groundlessness, we have to look at how both systems deploy highly specific corrective tools. Because even if you logically understand the causal web or you understand the neurolinguistic feedback loop, the friction of everyday life constantly pulls you back into map clinging.
The daily grind makes you forget. You get a stressful email, and suddenly you are reifying the sender, the situation, and yourself all over again. So let's examine these corrective maps. General semantics explicitly brands itself as a non-Aristotelian system. It actively seeks to replace binary either logic. Aristotle's law of the excluded middle states that a thing is either A or not A. General semantics attempts to replace this with what they call infinite-valued logic.
Infinite-valued logic is designed to capture the fluid statistical complexity of the territory. In a relativistic quantum universe, nothing is 100% A or 100% not A. Everything exists on a spectrum of probabilities, degrees of certainty, and structural variances. General semantics trains the mind to think in percentages and contexts, completely breaking the rigid binary grid of traditional logic.
And for our expert listener, the direct parallel here is Madhyamaka's use of non-binary logic, most famously the Katuko, or the tetralemma. The tetralemma forces the mind to analyze a proposition, such as whether a cause produces an effect, and exhausts all four logical corners. It is not, it both is and is not, it neither is nor is not. By proving all four options logically absurd in terms of inherent existence, Madhyamaka forces the intellect to crash.
It induces a state of profound conceptual silence.
Yes. But this is where we must align the maps of both systems with absolute precision, because this is where even advanced practitioners of both disciplines get severely tripped up. In Madhyamaka, there is a critical safeguard. Emptiness is also empty. Shunyata shunyata. Emptiness is not the ultimate territory. It is not a dark cosmic void hiding beneath the atoms.
No, it's a tool.
It's a conceptual eraser used to wipe away your clinging to inherent existence.
It is a corrective map. Mistaking emptiness for the ultimate territory is a secondary, much more dangerous trap.
Right.
If you reify emptiness, you're just replacing a conventional everyday delusion with a highly sophisticated philosophical delusion. You are still eating the menu, you've just ordered a more expensive menu. And in general semantics, the direct parallel to emptiness is their suite of extensional devices.
The extensional devices, let's delve into the mechanics of these. The primary ones are indexing and dating. How does a GS practitioner use indexing?
Indexing is a mental or written tag used to break up absolute categories and force the brain back to the specific territory. Instead of saying politicians are corrupt, you index the statement. Politician 1 is not politician 2.
You literally assign mathematical subscripts to your concepts.
Yes, you force your nervous system to recognize the specific, localized, non-identical reality of the individual over the generic, abstracted map of the category. You are reminding yourself that the category does not exist in the physical world, only the individuals exist.
And dating is adding a temporal subscript, a timestamp. So if I have the thought, I am a failure, which is heavy with the is of identity, I apply dating. I failed that specific examination in July of 2026.
By dating the statement, you inject the space-time continuum back into your language. You turn a static, permanent noun, a failure, into a localized, temporary process. You allow for the possibility of change.
I think of emptiness and these GS extensional devices like an uninstaller program on a computer. You realize you have malware running in the background of your operating system. That malware is map clinging, reification, the assumption of Svabhava. So you run the uninstaller program, which is emptiness or indexing or dating. The program goes in, isolates the corrupt files, and deletes them. But once the malware is removed, you don't keep running the uninstaller program on a continuous loop forever. You close the uninstaller and you just use the clean computer.
If you keep running the uninstaller, you can't actually interface with the operating system. You paralyze yourself. The devices, like emptiness, are medicine for the disease of dogmatism. Once the dogmatism is cured, you don't keep taking the medicine.
But this analogy prompts the ultimate question. When the uninstaller finishes its job, when all the flawed maps are erased, what are we left looking at? What is the clean operating system?
And this is where we finally reach the wall. When the maps are erased, we arrive at the exact coordinate where general semantics and Madhyamaka fundamentally break apart in their view of the ultimate bedrock of reality. This is the metaphysical chasm.
Let's step into the chasm. Because superficially, both systems seem to be pointing toward the same dynamic, fluid reality, but their underlying assumptions are radically different. This comes down to process orientation versus triadic deconstruction.
General semantics is deeply foundationally process-oriented. Korzybski's entire mission was to replace static nouns with fluid verbs. To a GS practitioner, the universe isn't made of things, it is made of happenings.
Right.
The submicroscopic quantum world is an endless dance of energetic processes. And to general semantics, those actions, those relations, those energetic processes are real. They constitute the objective territory.
GS wants you to stop looking at a static photograph and realize you're actually watching a movie, and they believe the movie is real.
But Madhyamaka takes a massive radical step further. Nagarjuna declares that processes, relations, and actions are just as conceptually fabricated as static nouns.
He takes the verbs down, too. He doesn't just dismantle the nouns, he dismantles the happenings.
He dismantles the entire framework of interaction. For you listening, this is Nagarjuna's deconstruction of the triads in the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. Take any action, like the act of perceiving. You have the perceiver, the act of perceiving, and the perceived object. Because each element entirely depends on the other two to exist, you cannot locate a perceiver without an object to perceive, nor an act of perception without a perceiver. None of them possess independent reality. The action itself is completely empty.
Madhyamaka is essentially saying to general semantics, you realized the photograph was an illusion, and you realized you were watching a movie. Good job. But the movie is also an illusion. There's no projector, there is no film, and there is no screen.
This is perhaps the most crucial distinction for a Madhyamaka practitioner to maintain when engaging with Western process philosophies or systems theories. General semantics treats process or action as the true reality hiding beneath the illusion of things. Madhyamaka treats process as yet another conceptual illusion, an empty map. It is a more refined, highly sophisticated map than a static noun, but it's still a map.
So if general semantics believes the movie of processes is objectively real, what do they believe is powering the projector? What is the actual bedrock for them?
This brings us to the deepest metaphysical divide of all, scientific realism versus radical anti-realism. At its core, general semantics is fundamentally a materialist philosophy. It is neurolinguistic materialism. Korzybski posited a real, objective, submicroscopic, physical foundation underlying all human maps. Atoms, electrons, quantum fields, thermodynamics, these are physically real. The territory is objective matter and energy.
And the ultimate goal of general semantics is to make our mental maps isomorphic to that physical territory? Isomorphic meaning structurally matching. GS wants your brain to perfectly align with the objective laws of physics. In their view, matter precedes mind. If the human brain dies, the perceiver vanishes, but the quantum field keeps on spinning independently.
But Madhyamaka asserts radical groundlessness. There is absolutely no foundation. There is no physical bedrock, no mental bedrock, no mystical cosmic consciousness serving as the floor of the universe. Even dependent origination itself is merely a conventional description.
Mind-matter co-emptiness. Neither matter nor mind has ontological priority. You cannot find a functioning brain without a consciousness perceiving or conceptualizing it, and you cannot find consciousness without an object to be conscious of.
If we connect this divergence to how they view the concept of time, the chasm widens even further. General semantics is a philosophy deeply invested in linear progress. They define humans as time binders. Time is structurally tied to the physical universe, and human civilization evolves linearly by passing down increasingly accurate, more isomorphic linguistic maps. For GS, progress is real.
But Nāgārjuna dedicates an entire chapter to refuting time. He demonstrates that past, present, and future cannot exist inherently because they only exist in relation to one another. You can't have a present without a past, so the present isn't an independent entity. There's no absolute temporal bridge. Therefore, the very concept of linear evolutionary progress, which general semantics heavily relies on to cure societal ills, is a conventional illusion.
There is no ultimate forward to progress toward, because the ultimate truth is outside of conceptual time entirely.
I think about this in terms of spatial orientation. General semantics realizes our current house is crooked. The maps are bad. So they want to tear the house down, dig deep into the dirt, find the solid physical bedrock of quantum mechanics, and pour a perfectly level concrete floor. They want to build a sane house on a real foundation. But Madhyamaka is like being thrown into deep space. There is no dirt. There is no bedrock. There is no up and no down. You can't build a floor because there's nothing to rest it on.
That spatial analogy highlights the anxiety many people feel when confronting Madhyamaka. And it raises an important practical question about how these two systems interact with the evolution of science. How does a general semantics practitioner react when science drastically updates its models, for instance, when quantum mechanics challenges classical Newtonian physics?
Oh, a GS practitioner celebrates. They say, this is fantastic. We have a more isomorphic map. We are getting closer to the real physical bedrock. But how does a Madhyamaka practitioner view that exact same scientific breakthrough?
The Madhyamaka practitioner acknowledges that the new quantum map is conventionally more predictive, mathematically more elegant, and technologically more useful. but they do not believe it gets them one single inch closer to ultimate reality. Because ultimate reality is the complete absence of any conceptualizable structure. A better map is just a better map. It never magically transforms into the territory.
Which leads us to the ultimate destinations of both systems. Because these opposing views on the foundation of reality lead directly to completely distinct therapeutic goals for a human life. What is the final destination for a practitioner of general semantics versus a practitioner of Madhyamaka?
General semantics aims for sanity and sociocultural adjustment. Korzybski developed this system in the wake of the First World War. He looked at humanity tearing itself apart with industrialized slaughter and ideological fanaticism, and he concluded that we were literally insane because our maps were wildly out of sync with reality.
So it's very pragmatic.
Extremely. GS is a pragmatic tool to stop emotional overreactions, clear semantic blockages, and align the human nervous system with the real physical universe so we can survive and thrive as a species.
It's about achieving corticothalamic integration. It's about optimizing the human animal to live rationally in a complex technological society. But Madhyamaka aims for something entirely different. It aims for nirvana.
Madhyamaka aims for the total cessation of conceptual proliferation, which is known as prapanyaka. It aims to dismantle the machinery of samsara entirely. It is not merely about psychological optimization or becoming a well-adjusted, highly functioning citizen of the world. It is about radical spiritual liberation from the cycle of suffering itself.
Let's compare their ultimate states of awareness. In general semantics, they strive to experience what they call the silent or objective level. This is the wordless, submicroscopic physical experience of the present moment. Korzybski used to famously pinch a student during a lecture and ask, "What is this?" And if the student said, "A pinch," Korzybski would say, "No, that is a word. The raw neurological feeling before the word is generated, that is the reality."
That silent level is the closest general semantics gets to Madhyamaka's ultimate state, which is tathat, or suchness, often expressed through the noble silence. Both systems ultimately point to a non-verbal, non-conceptual reality. But what the map is not the territory means to both of them at the finish line is profoundly different.
General semantics says, your map is flawed. Look closer at the actual physical territory using the scientific method, align your nervous system with that objective reality, and live a sane, productive life. Madhyamaka says, your belief in an ultimate territory is the final trap. The territory is empty, the map is empty, and the cartographer is empty. Rest in the freedom of groundlessness.
And that is the metaphysical chasm.
But this leaves me with a highly practical question for you. We spent this entire time in deep metaphysical analysis, but what does this fluid life actually look like day to day for a Madhyamaka practitioner who has actively abandoned the general semantics search for an isomorphic map and instead embraces this radical groundlessness? How does losing a solid foundation make one more secure? Because frankly, floating in deep space with no floor sounds terrifying.
It sounds terrifying to the ego, which requires boundaries and definitions to maintain its illusion of control. But the profound security of groundlessness is the ultimate paradox of Madhyamaka. When you rely on a solid foundation, whether that foundation is your bank account, your social status, a rigid political ideology, or even an unshakable scientific worldview, you live in a state of constant underlying anxiety that your foundation will eventually crack.
Because it's impermanent.
Exactly. If the map fails, your entire reality shatters.
You spend your whole life doing crisis management on the foundation.
But when you deeply realize that it is fluidity all the way down, unexpected changes aren't catastrophic deviations from a solid plan. They are just the natural shifting conditions of suchness. If a business venture fails, you don't become the fixed noun of a failure. You stop trying to define your essence altogether. Security no longer means standing on a concrete rock that cannot move. True security means realizing you are perfectly capable of balancing on ways that never stop moving. You use conventional maps, money, schedules, social roles, scientific models perfectly, but you never mistake the game for an absolute trap.
That is a phenomenal synthesis. We started by looking at how general semantics offers an incredibly robust, pragmatic Western toolkit for cleaning up our conventional maps. Through mechanics like E-prime, indexing, dating, and infinite-valued logic, GS diagnoses the exact same linguistic disease of reification as Nāgārjuna. It is a brilliant, scientifically grounded system for achieving sanity, but it ultimately stops at a materialist bedrock.
And Madhyamaka takes those exact same insights into the failure of language and dissolves the bedrock entirely. It takes the deconstruction all the way down, proving that causes, processes, and time itself are empty maps. leaving us in the dynamic, ungraspable flux of suchness.
It is an amazing convergence and an equally profound divergence. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, our expert listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over regarding how we might integrate these systems.
I'm curious to see how you bridge them practically.
Well, Madhyamaka insists that we must still skillfully navigate the conventional world Satya without clinging to it. We still have to use language to buy groceries, negotiate contracts, and interact with society. We can't just remain in noble silence forever. So my question is this. Could the semantic hygiene tools of Alfred Korzybski, like actively using E-prime to ban the is of identity, or dating our statements to acknowledge change, or mentally hyphenating spacetime, could these tools actually serve as the perfect modern middle-way software for a Madhyamaka practitioner? Could general semantics be the ultimate pragmatic interface for a Buddhist to safely talk about and navigate the conventional world, so long as they remember to never reify the software itself?
That is a compelling proposition. Using a materialist linguistic toolkit to maintain groundless spiritual awareness in a highly technological neurolinguistic age. It is essentially using the precision of the X-ray machine to navigate the muddy waters, while fully realizing that the X-ray itself is just an interplay of light and shadow.
Circling right back to the diagnosis, you can use the machine, just don't worship it. Thank you so much for exploring this chasm with me, and a huge thank you to our listener for joining us on this deep dive into comparing general semantic and Madhyamaka.
It has been a fascinating structural exploration.
Until next time, stay curious and always keep questioning the map.